Hi. Welcome to week 2, where we're going to read 2 more stories. Before we get started, I want to explain something really quickly. Remember that you're supposed to have a total of 4 things on Canvas each week under discussions. You're supposed to respond, or you're supposed to post 2 discussion posts and respond to 2. So for each story, you're going to write 1 discussion post, and then in response to any of them, you have to respond to 2. Okay, so that's 4 in total. 1 for one story, another for another story, and then 2 responses. Okay, relatively straightforward. The word lengths are, for the 2 main discussion posts, each have to be at least 300 words. The comments responding to another person's have to be at least 150. Of course, you're more than welcome to go beyond that. Don't go like a page, because no one wants to read that. You don't want to write that. So, straightforward. I hope you enjoyed last week's stories. I'm still kind of learning the YouTube thing, so I created 2 videos, 1 for each story, and I didn't really like that format. It took forever to do, so I think what I'm going to do is just make 1 longer video about both of the stories. So while last time we read something kind of quirky and magically realist, these 2 stories are very much rooted in reality. They're realist stories in that this could very well happen. We hear these kinds of things on the news all the time, particularly with the Joyce Carol Oates story, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? So while last week was magical realist, this week is going to be rooted in reality, okay? So we're going to start with Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? By Joyce Carol Oates, which is a classic short story in American fiction. I would say actually globally, just because it's required in many upper-level English classes, and I really wanted you guys to read it. 1, because of its fame and its notoriety, because it is a crazy story, but also because it is really particularly well done in terms of how it creates a point of view. A specific way that we're looking at the story is deliberate on the part of the author. So, Joyce Carol Oates is kind of famous for her personality being kind of strange. If you have Twitter, follow her on Twitter. She's weird, in a good way. She's just like a quirky old lady. But she's also really famous for having a ton of books, tons and tons of writing. She's very prolific. She's written like 35 books, which is, I mean, that's a lot. So you consider the breadth of her work, and her early work is really just famous for the kinds of things that she does and Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? So this story, you read it. You have your opinion on it. It's one of my favorites, mostly because it is so weird and very out there in terms of how we're supposed to feel about it. We don't really know what happens to Connie at the end. We don't know what to do with this character, Arnold, and we certainly don't know what to do with Connie. She seems really irritating at first. We're like, Connie, grow the hell up. You're 15 years old. We get it. But then she has to make this very mature decision at the end of the story. Like, do I go with this man who's threatening my family, or do I compromise my own safety? Like, what? That's a mature decision that she has to suddenly come to terms with very fast on a hot summer's day, very much like this one. So, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been is set in the point of view is in third person, and I hope you guys have been reading Lenses, because this is really helpful. It's in third person, and you want to ask yourself, when anything's in third person, where is the perspective coming from? Who is the person I'm seeing the story through? So considering, and the book, Lenses uses Harry Potter as an example, so that's, I think, a good one, because many people have seen the movies or read the books. But the primary storytelling is told through Harry Potter, right? Like, we see what's happening to Harry Potter through Harry Potter's eyes. So we understand his feelings for it, for the situation with Lily and James, all these things that happen to Ron and Hermione. We understand what he's going through. So when you're reading the story, or when you're writing about it, think about it. Who are we standing behind and looking at the world through? Are we looking at it through Connie's perspective, or are we looking at it through Arnold's perspective? It could be both. I'm thinking of something like Game of Thrones, which switches perspectives consistently. We have the point of view of Cersei watching in the tower, or we see John doing whatever because he's boring. But those are different perspectives that we need to understand the entirety of the situation in the war, right? So in this story, do we get just Connie's perspective or just Arnold's perspective? Or is it a mix of both? And understanding who we see it through, at what time, and if it even happens if we switch around, that's really important in understanding what Joyce Carol Oates is trying to get us to think about in this story. Okay, so when we look, if it is indeed both Arnold and Connie's perspectives, what prompts this change? And this is a thing that you can study throughout all of literature. I keep taking my glasses off because all I see is my reflection. So what prompts the shift from perspectives, right? Is it adding tension? Is it going to get us to understand what a character feels? All of these things are really important. Okay. One of the other things that the book tells us, Lenses tells us, is talks about tone. And in the book it says, another important aspect of I'm on page 63 if you want to read on. Another important aspect of third-person narration is the narrator's tone or attitude towards his or her characters. Questions about tone are wrapped up in questions about who the narrator actually is, and it may actually be helpful at this juncture to think about the narrator as just another character in the story. I think we should go beyond what the textbook tells us and definitely always consider the narrator as another character in the story. That's an integral part of what I research personally, but also how we understand how literary and artistic things in general are created. Who tells the story is very, very important. And I need you guys to remember this. And if you want to write it down in all capital letters, feel free to do so. The author is not the narrator. Okay? The author is not the narrator, nor is the poet the speaker of the poem. Those people are completely different, okay? So, in your discussion post, if you see that the author is telling the story, I will take off points. That is fundamentally wrong, okay? The author is not the narrator. The narrator is his or her own entity, okay? So, when we consider where are you going, where have you been, tone comes to be really important. How is the narrator treating Connie, Arnold, and, oh my god, the weird friend who sits in the car, I forgot his name. How are we treating them? How is the narrator looking at them? How is he or she explaining them? So, think about it in terms of regards to the very beginning, too. Connie's mom is very judgmental of Connie and always comparing her to her sister. What does that tell us about the point of view and the tone, right? What kind of tone does that set up for Connie's character and how she's going to behave further in the story? Now that you're done with it, you know what happens or doesn't happen. I think that's one of why the reason the story is so famous is we don't really know what Connie does. Think about character. Oh, yes. One way to really understand the way point of view works is to imagine what would be different if the story were told through another person's perspective. So imagine Harry Potter being told through Hermione's eyes. Hermione is a character who is castigated. She's bullied for being a muggle-born child and having wizard powers. So if we take that into account, her gender as a woman, her ability to be, she is way smarter than Harry and Ron. She carries the plot most of the time. Like, she saves their asses plenty of times. How would that perspective, if we got Hermione's perspective, how would the entire series change, right? We'd understand a lot more about the magic wizarding world. We'd understand a lot more about what Hermione feels as a woman and having to save these guys' asses all the time. And I think we'd understand a little bit more about how the political dynamics of the country or the wizarding world works, right? And that's just an example. Consider the way it works here. What if we were told the entire story in first person from Arnold's perspective? Arnold's friend is creepy as shit, right? Like, he is just this weird dude who shows up in her yard, and he looks he looks younger than he actually is. He takes off his sunglasses, and he's all of a sudden real old and looks creepy. Rides in a car that is painted over. That looks sketchy. Anytime you see a car on the side of the road, you're like, no, that was definitely painted over. That's the kind of thing that it is. It's a golden jalopy that was probably a different color. So imagine some kids spray painting paint all over a car. That's what I always imagine when I think of Arnold. So these are questions to think about perspective and tone in where are you going, where have you been. Very similarly, we've got A Temporary Matter by Jhumpa Lahiri, which is, I'm so sorry that I don't regret assigning this, but I do kind of, because it is a profoundly upsetting story. There's a lot happening. It's not fun in the way that the first two were. And it's not fun in the sense that where Joyce Carol Oates' story is like, wait, you don't know what's going to happen. I think in A Temporary Matter, you know what's going to happen, and you see it unravel in front of you, and that's upsetting. And also the plot of losing a child is just sad. Okay, so same questions for this one. Who is telling the story? There is a third-person narrator, yes, but whose perspective do we get it from? Do we get it from Shobha, or do we get it from Shukumar? Because that's a very different dynamic, right? If we get it from Shobha's point of view, we would get certain things. If we get it from Shukumar's, we get a very different thing, right? So ask yourself, who am I looking through to see the scenes in the story? Whose thoughts do I understand? Whose thoughts am I getting? All of these things. And of course, that works for the other story too. One of the integral parts of this story is from the outset. If we read the first line, it says, the notice informed them that it was a temporary matter. For 5 days, their electricity would be cut off for 1 hour, beginning at 8 p.m. So when we understand that the idea of darkness happening just for a little while, a temporary matter, what does that do for the tone of how we establish these characters and the perspective that we get? One of the things that you have to consider is that the words a temporary matter mean a few different things, right? So you've got a temporary matter of the lights going off for only an hour. That's not too long of a time. You've got the temporary matter of the child being born or being in gestation just for a little while and not making it to birth. That's a temporary thing, an unfortunate thing. And the other more glaring and I think obvious one that's a temporary matter would be their marriage, right? Like we find out at the end that Shobha's been looking for an apartment complex or a different apartment, and we don't. I mean, Shukumar doesn't really know what to do with that. Like he says, I feel betrayed. Like where he thinks that, or we understand that he thinks that is, we had this awesome time this whole week getting to know each other once again, getting that rebirth. Like our relationship rebirthed in this wonderful way. We made love again after this trauma, and here you are just kind of breaking expectations, and now you're doing this. Like we're not together anymore at the end of the story. So what does the lack of light do in terms of the point of view and the perspectives that we're getting here? I think it'll be interesting for you to reread at least the beginning and the end to see, or like just the scenes where they are going back in the dark to see what's changing. In addition, think about how the perspective changes when we, or the narration in general and the perspective both change when we talk about the baby's death. That is the kind of the heart of the story. Is it revolves around this awful tragedy in their lives. They're young, they're successful, and then here is this thing that they can't help. Like and Shukumar's not there, so he feels terrible about it. And his mother-in-law doesn't really help the situation. So how does the baby's death play into the character's point of view? What about that influences how these characters behave, how we learn about them, how we are supposed to feel about them, all of these things, right? So one of the last things I want to talk about is Jhumpa Lahiri, the author of A Temporary Matter. is known for imagery, creating images that are very vivid. So if you look at any of the food scenes, or let's see, I'm just trying to scroll here. Nope, I can't find it. Of course I can't. That's okay. If we look at the second paragraph, it's good of them to warn us, Shobha concealed after reading the notice aloud, more for her own benefit than Shukumar's. She let the strap of her leather satchel, plump with files, slip off from her shoulders, and left it in the hallway as she walked into the kitchen. She wore a navy blue pomplin raincoat over gray sweatpants and white sneakers, looking, at 33, the type of woman she'd once claimed she'd never resemble. So what is the narrator telling us about Shobha here, right? Like, here is this very intricate image that Lahiri paints for us through the narrator. What are we supposed to learn about the character here? What are we supposed to learn about the perspective? Is it Shukumar looking at Shobha to tell us this? Is it another person, like not Shukumar telling us? What is happening here in those scenes? Also consider the scenes with the food, the way that they sit in the light, and how they behave with other people. The only interaction is the one with the Bensons, the elderly couple who lives next door to them. So how are we supposed to look at that point of view and understand how these characters are functioning together? Yeah, that's about it. I don't want to keep these videos too long. I want you guys to do the most of the work. I hope you've enjoyed these two stories. I'm sorry they're kind of sad, but I'm also excited that you're reading them. A Temporary Matter is particularly important to me just because it was the first Lahiri story I've ever read, and it just blew my mind. So, enjoy the week. Make sure you read the stories and respond to people and do the discussion posts. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to respond. Have a great week. Bye.